Welcome to the second episode in a Legendarium series about the Black Death. This episode, The Reign of the Grim Reaper, will look at the spread of the plague through Italy and use Florence as a case study for life during the Black Death. Then we'll look at how the plague came to Avignon and Pope Clement's response to it. Tragically, the Black Death led to many pogroms across Europe against the Jews who were blamed for causing the Black Death as it spread through France. Though physicians went on frantic searches for a cure, they were powerless to stop the plague from coming to England. The bubonic plague arrived in Europe from Asia at the end of the year 1347, ending the lives of 30 to 40 million of Europe's 80 million people. Chroniclers wrote of terrible omens in the months leading up to the plague. Merchants were said to have brought stories of torrential rains of fire falling upon the cities of China, reducing great palaces and temples to ashes. Stories from Persia told of serpents and toads falling from the sky in a rain, entering the dwellings of the Persians and eating them alive. These were likely flourishes added to the chronicles, but omens or not, the first plague ships came to continental Europe from the Crimea in the final months of 1347. They were manned by sailors covered with strange black swellings that oozed bloody pus, followed by boils and black blotches that rotted the victim's flesh away. By the spring of 1348, the plague spread from Genoa throughout the southern Mediterranean. Across Italy, city leaders issued frantic orders to burn any suspect ship coming into their harbor. They also expelled the prostitutes and issued orders to clean up the animal innards and human waste off the streets. Other towns begged the Pope for help, while the town of Orvieto simply ignored the Black Death altogether. These desperate precautions did not save some Italian cities from a death rate as high as 50 or even 60%. The Italian city of Florence offers an example of what Italian cities endured. When the Black Death arrived, no one knew how it spread. Guesswork took the place of knowledge. People claimed that speaking with a plague victim, or looking at them, or even thinking of the plague could sicken a person. Not surprisingly, panic gripped Florence, and anybody who could loaded their carriage and fled to the countryside. Some hoped that temperate living would be enough to save them, so they shut themselves up in their houses to live on bread and weak wine, forbidding all discussion of the plague. Others, believing that the end was near anyway, lived as if there was no tomorrow. They entered the houses of those who fled the city, raiding their wine cellars and cupboards, eating, drinking, singing, and fornicating. Some plague victims even believed that sniffing pretty flowers would be enough to protect them from the plague, but ultimately all of them were wrong. Tens of thousands of Florentines died and had to be thrown into trenches dug around the city, hurled into a jumble of bent elbows and knees. They were buried so shallow that wolves and dogs dug up the bodies to eat. It was especially hard on Florence's children. Of the 10,000 school children recorded in Florence, 8,000 of them wound up in the plague pits. To a devoutly Christian society, burying the dead without last rites was unthinkable only a year ago, but now it had become commonplace. The plague arrived in Avignon around the same time, in January 1348. The papal seat had been moved from Rome to Avignon 40 years earlier, when Pope Clement V fled the militias of Roman nobles for the relative safety of France. The Avignon popes had become infamous for their willingness to forgive any sin for a price and then using that money to finance an extravagant lifestyle. Pope Clement VI had a staff of 400 who worked his kitchens, dining halls, money chambers, and even a zoo for the papal menagerie, including a lion and a bear. However, luxury would not save Avignon. A pneumatic strain of the plague erupted in the city. Victims endured violent, uncontrollable coughs that caused them to double over in the streets or hurl themselves against walls. Bloody mucus poured from their mouths. In the first 3 months of 1348, the city ran out of cemetery space after burying 11,000 dead. Pope Clement at first bought more cemeteries. However, the pigs roaming the streets of Avignon gathered nightly in the graveyard to dig up the recently buried, eat them, and each morning the people of Avignon saw a horde of pigs leaving the cemetery, congealed blood encrusting their snouts. In the end, people resorted to simply hurling the dead into the Rhone River by the hundreds, where they were washed out to the Mediterranean Sea. To help them as best he could, Pope Clement blessed the Rhone River. In local churches, priests told the faithful that the pestilence was a blessing from God, sent to strengthen Christians through suffering. However, the monks and brothers of La Pignotte, the local almshouse for the Avignon poor, took more direct action by feeding and tending to the sick. They swabbed their oozing pustules, bandaged their feet gone cracked and gangrenous from the plague, and washed the blood-stained floors twice a day. Tragically, the concentration of so many sick in La Pignotte turned it into a death trap for both the sick and the monks who heroically tended them. For medieval people, the prospect of damnation likely terrified them more than death. So many people died that they could not find enough priests to administer last rites. So Pope Clement gave a blanket absolution of sin to all those who died of the Black Death, and even waived a papal ban on autopsies so doctors could study the disease. Yet in the end, Pope Clement looked out for himself. His doctors recommended that he spend the pestilential summer surrounded by roaring fires, in the belief that flame cleaned the air. In fact, it killed any plague fleas before they reached the Pope, and thus Clement became one of the few in Avignon to survive the Black Death. Not all physicians were as lucky. Indeed, they were baffled by the plague. They could not even determine if it was spread by air, food, or human touch. So the physicians of Paris studied the stars and determined that the pestilence was not of Earth. They claimed that God caused the planets to align in such a way as to produce plague. However, for the average man, there was a simpler explanation. It was God's judgment, punishment for the sins of humanity. However, as the plague spread through southern France, many blamed the Jews. Jews were already blamed for many horrible things in the medieval world. Many Christians assumed the Jews murdered Christians and then used their blood to taint communion wafers. Others believed that Jews were actually monsters and only appeared human because of black magic fueled by the ritual sacrifice of kidnapped children. Medieval conspiracy theories even claimed that an international plot of Jews poisoned wells with venom made from snakes, toads, and hearts torn from Christian bodies. Holy Week, when Christians remembered the crucifixion of Christ, had become a traditional time for violence against the Jews, as it was believed that the Jews had been responsible for the crucifixion of Christ. Most years, Easter brought smashed windows and bloodied noses, but in the plague year of 1348, Christians across the south of France smashed open doors in search of evidence for well poisonings. Anything, even a bottle of medicine, became so-called proof. Mobs dragged out the Jews, jeering, taunting, kicking, and spitting on them. After a mock trial, the Jews would be tied to stakes and set on fire. Thousands more would be roasted on grills, beaten to death, or drowned in rivers. Needless to say, it did nothing to stop the plague. However, since Jews were forced to work as money lenders under royal law at the time, it gave many people in medieval Europe a chance to wipe out their debts by murdering their creditors. Modern estimates believe that the Black Death moved at a rate of 8 miles a day. By the summer of 1348, it reached Paris. King Philip, a man supposedly so pious that he wrote a law commanding that blasphemers have their upper lips cut off, fled the city, and spent the next 2 years desperately trying to avoid the plague. While we tend to remember the Black Death in cities, as plague chroniclers usually lived there, it hit the countryside just as hard. Some villages lost 70% of their population. Few workers remained to prepare for next year's harvest, and many of those who survived believed that the world would end soon. So why should they bother working for next year? Little work was done to prepare for the harvest of 1349, paving the way for food shortages that would further add to the Black Death's toll. What especially terrified Europeans was the seemingly random nature of the Black Death. An entire family might die within a week, but their neighbors would be spared. Some towns suffered no dead, while others became ghost towns in a few weeks. Contemporaries compared living with the Black Death to being in a shower of arrows. Some men died, some lived, and it seemed to be a matter of luck whether you lived or died. So plague sufferers prayed to Saint Sebastian, a holy man who survived being pierced by arrows. When those prayers went unanswered, victims prayed to Saint Roch, a holy man who survived the plague. Those prayers went unanswered as well. It did not take long before strange cures began to make the rounds, some prescribed by respectable doctors, others peddled by outright frauds. In the belief the plague traveled by air, some people carried sweet-smelling flowers or herbs wherever they went. The French upper classes preferred pomander, balls of perfume. Still other people heard rumors that the stench of sewage fended off the plague, so people clustered around sewers in the hope that the smell of feces and urine would keep them safe. As the disease continued, so-called cures became more and more outlandish. They included bathing in urine to cure plague sores and rubbing pastes made of tree resins, flower roots, and human feces into the plague sores. One of the strangest cures was promoted by a doctor named Thomas Vickery, who advised patients to shave a chicken's bottom, strap the chicken so its bare bottom touched their throat, and hope that the chicken absorbed the illness. Needless to say, none of these cures helped. By the time the plague came to England in autumn 1348, people knew what was coming. Just 2 years ago, the English had defeated the French at Crécy, and many English lords and ladies paraded around in stolen French furs and jewels. The more pious English, perhaps fearing for their souls as the plague raged, sent the booty back to France. One of the first English victims of the Black Death was 15-year-old Princess Joan, daughter of King Edward III. She arrived in France to marry Prince Pedro of Castile and brushed aside warnings of the plague. Sometime in autumn of that year, she died along with most of her wedding party. Her heartbroken father, Edward III, offered a fortune to anyone who retrieved his daughter's body, yet fear of the Black Death was so strong that he found no takers. Her body was likely burned in October 1348 when the French mayor of Bordeaux burned the port in a failed attempt to stop the Black Death. The plague autumn in England coincided with one of the rainiest seasons in memory. In the soggy fields, thousands of sheep died after being bitten by plague fleas. As many as 5,000 sheep perished in a single pasture, their bodies so rotten that not even the crows would eat them. The Black Death emptied whole villages, with only a few survivors limping away to find an area with more people. Yet throughout most of England, people maintained public order. Unlike Italy and France, people knew what was coming and they prepared for it. Village reeves organized survivors to farm as much land as they could as best as they could. Churches continued to function despite 2 archbishops of Canterbury dying within a year. Royal courts remained open, and even the mass graves around London were filled with charcoal and ash to slow the putrefaction process and thus slow the plague. Order had been maintained, but the reign of King Death in England had only begun. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.